final hours of Byron laxed forgotten on death row. Hello, friends. Tonight we open the final chapter in the life of a man who spent 35 years on Tennessee's death row. His name was Byron Lewis Black, once a husband, a father, and a quiet figure in Nashville's working class. But in 1988, he shattered 3 lives in a single night, leaving behind a trail of grief that lasted for decades. For more than 3 decades, appeals, psychiatric evaluations, and legal arguments kept him alive. Yet time ran out, and in August 2025, the state of Tennessee carried out his execution. In this video, we will walk you through his crime, his trial, the decades he spent inside a tiny cell, and finally, the haunting details of his last 24 hours on Earth, his last meal, his last words, and the exact moment he took his final breath. Stay with me, and don't forget to subscribe for more prison documentary stories. Dear friends, on August 5th, 2025, the state of Tennessee ended the life of Byron Lewis Black. He had been on death row for 35 years, longer than some of the guards who escorted him had even been alive. For decades, his appeals bounced through the courts, his mental state questioned, and his body slowly deteriorated inside a 6x9 cell. But that final night, none of it mattered anymore. The countdown was over. To understand how he ended up in that sterile chamber with IV lines in his arms, we need to go back, not to his final hours, but to the spring of 1988. It was March 25th. 1988. Nashville was quiet, the air just beginning to cool after a long day. Byron was 32 years old, already serving time for a separate crime. But he was on weekend furlough from the Davidson County Workhouse. To the guards, he was just another inmate who always returned on schedule. They had no idea he had a gun and a plan burning inside him. That night, 23-year-old Angela Clay tucked her daughters into bed. Latoya was 9 years old, a bright little girl who loved helping her mother in the kitchen. 6-year-old Lkesha adored her big sister, following her everywhere. Their world was simple: school, church, family dinners. But Angela was hiding a truth. She was afraid of Byron. Byron was no stranger to Angela. He had once shot her ex-husband, Benny, during a confrontation in the street. Benny survived, but the bullet stayed lodged in his shoulder for years. To Angela, Byron was dangerous. To her daughters, though, he was still someone familiar. That would prove fatal. Just after midnight, Byron slipped into Angela's apartment. Some say he still had a key. Others think the door wasn't locked. Inside, silence ruled Angela asleep in her bed. Her daughters tucked safely down the hall. But Byron had no intention of leaving them that way. He crept into Angela's room and fired a single bullet into her skull. She never woke. Lying beside her was Latoya, startled by the sound. When she stirred, Byron turned the gun on her and pulled the trigger again. Down the hall, little Lkesha had already woken from the noise. She padded into the hallway, trusting the familiar face she saw. But Byron raised the gun once more, and 2 bullets ended her young life. 3 lives were gone in minutes. Byron locked the door behind him and vanished into the night. For 2 days, no one knew. Angela didn't show up for work. Her family tried calling, but there was no answer. On March 28th, Angela's mother couldn't wait any longer. She drove to the apartment, knocked on the door, and when no one came, she called the police. The officer who climbed through the back window found the scene that would haunt him forever. Angela in her bed, a gunshot wound to the head. Latoya wedged between furniture, her blood staining the sheets. And 6-year-old Lkesha face down beside her bed, small handprints in blood, showing she had tried to crawl away before she died. The evidence came quickly. Byron's fingerprints were on the phone and scattered through the apartment. Ballistics linked the bullets to the same revolver he had used to shoot Angela's ex-husband years before. The link was undeniable. In November 1988, Byron faced trial. The courtroom was heavy with grief. Angela's family sat in silence. Reporters lined the walls, and the jury listened as prosecutors described the cold efficiency of the killings. They argued Byron had been driven by jealousy, rage, and a need to control Angela. They reminded the jury of his earlier attack on Benny. They showed the bloody evidence, the bullet casings, and the forensic proof. The defense tried to argue it was circumstantial. They suggested Byron wasn't mentally stable, that he was paranoid, perhaps even delusional, but the jury wasn't swayed. After only a few hours, they returned with the verdict guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to death. As the words echoed through the courtroom, a single tear rolled down Byron's face. It would be the last emotion anyone saw from him for decades. Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville became his new world. A 6 by 9 foot cell, a steel bunk, a toilet, a sink. The man who once stalked streets with a gun now spent 23 hours a day in silence. For years, he filed appeals. His lawyers argued he was mentally ill, that he suffered from schizophrenia, delusions, and paranoia. Psychiatrists pointed to brain damage and depression. They said his perception of reality was fractured, but the courts weren't convinced. The evidence was too strong, the crime too brutal. Through the 1990s and 2000s, his case lingered. By the 2010s, he had become one of the longest-serving inmates on Tennessee's death row. Guards described him as quiet, polite, even respectful, but he never admitted guilt, not once. As years passed, Byron's body began to fail him. He developed chronic kidney disease, heart problems, and dementia that sometimes left him confused. He was fitted with a spinal cord stimulator for pain management, a medical device implanted in his back. His attorneys argued this device could interfere with lethal injection, possibly causing him pain or even malfunctioning during the process. They called it cruel and unusual punishment, but Tennessee courts disagreed. His execution date was set for August 5th, 2025. Byron's last day began like any other on death row. Guards brought him breakfast, which he refused. He spent the morning quietly, mostly staring at the wall. Around noon, he spoke briefly with a spiritual advisor, but he declined visits from family. After nearly 4 decades, there weren't many left. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he was served his final meal, a fried fish sandwich, French fries, and a can of Pepsi. He barely touched it. By 6:45 in the evening, the guards entered his cell for the last time. They escorted him slowly to the execution chamber, removing his back brace, but leaving the spinal implant inside. Witnesses, including Angela's relatives, sat behind glass. Byron was strapped to the gurney, IV lines inserted into both arms. When asked for final words, he surprised many. For the first time in 35 years, he said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything I did. I've had a long time to think. I wish I could go back." At 7:10 in the evening, the drugs began to flow. His breathing slowed. His eyes closed. By 7:14 in the evening, he was pronounced dead. For the families of Angela, Latoya, and Lkesha, it was the end of a nightmare that had stretched across nearly 4 decades. For others, it sparked debate. Should a man so old, sick, and mentally fading be executed? Or did justice demand it? No matter how much time had passed. As the clock struck 7:14 in the evening on August 5th, 2025, Byron Lewis Black's life ended after 35 long years on Tennessee's death row. His final words, an apology that came far too late, did little to erase the decades of pain his actions had caused. For the family of Angela Clay and her 2 daughters, Latoya and Lkesha, his death was not a victory, but a closing chapter in a story that had haunted them since 1988. Friends, cases like Byron Black's force us to ask difficult questions. Was justice delayed too long? Should an aging, broken man still face execution? Or was this the only way to finally honor the memory of a young mother and 2 innocent girls whose lives were stolen in their sleep? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Deathwatch Diaries for more prison documentary stories that reveal the darkest corners of justice.